Thank you for your warm welcome. Thank you to the Center for East Asian Studies for bringing me here. My talk is titled Responsible Herding in Mongolia, Strategies and Politics of Managing the Risk of Dzode. And if you don't know what Dzode is, that's coming up in the first part of my presentation. And I'm also going to explain a little bit more about what I mean by responsible herding, because for me that's a politically loaded word, and I want to get into the politics of that. So my background, I became interested in Mongolia as a Peace Corps volunteer 2004 to 2006. I was teaching English in a small town in the central province, and also tried to get out and visit herding families as often as I could. And while in the Peace Corps, I began to ask myself, what kind of career would allow me to continue spending time in a marvelous place like this? So that's how I ended up in anthropology. I'm at the University of Arizona, and my initial research in Mongolia was in the summer of 2008. I'm now planning the main part of my dissertation research, which I hope will be next school year for the whole year. Since my research is about these winter disasters called Dzode, it would be useful for me to live with herders and see the whole cycle of how they prepare, how they deal with stresses and shocks during the winter, and then recover afterwards. And because I'm planning this research, I'd be interested in hearing any of your suggestions for me as I get the details of that in order. In my presentation, I'm going to first talk about what Dzode is. There are different types of Dzode, and we're finding from climate change projections that climate change is probably going to have an impact on Dzode, so I want to talk about that as well. Then I'll get into my own research on herders' coping strategies for Dzode. What are all the little tasks that they do throughout the year to prepare for this potential disaster, and then how do they deal with it? Past Dzode have caused food insecurity and triggered a lot of development work in rural Mongolia, and I want to talk about the trends in that development work, and then I get into the politics of responsibility by linking what's happening in development to certain ideologies that I think have been imported from the West and from the United States in particular. Dzode is often defined as, it's a fairly general definition, winter disaster that puts livestock at risk and therefore also puts herding households at risk of losing their livelihood. And there are different kinds. White Dzode is probably the most common. This is when you have a very deep snowfall and the animals can't dig through the snow to get at the grass underneath, so the animals may starve. Black Dzode is when you have a disaster even in the absence of that snow. Often there's no grass, maybe there was a drought in the summer, so there's nothing left to eat, and then it's usually associated with very, very cold temperatures, no sources of liquid water for the animals. During, when there's snow on the ground, the animals tend to eat snow to stay hydrated, but during Black Dzode they can become dehydrated, and that weakens them further. Then the icy or iron Dzode, the Musun or Tumur Dzode, are the same thing. When there's snow on the ground, there's a little warming and a little bit of melting of the snow, but then the cold weather comes back and it refreezes and forms this hard layer so that the animals have trouble breaking through that to reach the grass. And depending on who you talk to, you might hear about other types of Dzode as well. It's a fairly flexible term. Some people talk about a cold Dzode where animals simply die of the cold. So what kinds of trends are we likely to see with future Dzode? I wanted to comment on the picture also, the choice of the picture. I'm sorry, it's a little bit morbid, but this is a picture I took in May at the beginning of my 2008 research. You can see that there's almost no grass on the ground yet. The grass hadn't started growing yet. The animals had come through a very long winter and spring, were in a weakened state. And then the temperature in late May dropped down to almost freezing, and a lot of livestock died. And that just illustrates this connection that we see between hunger and cold. If the animals are hungry and weak, they're vulnerable to the cold. If they're cold, they're going to be more vulnerable to hunger.
What part of Mongolia was this again?
This is in, well, you'll see I have a map where I show you where I went on my research. This picture was taken in Henti province, which is in eastern Mongolia. And that's where this 2008 disaster was the worst. So these are the climate change projections from the IPCC, which is the International Panel of Climate Change, pretty much the authority on these types of projections. The top row shows temperature increases from the 1980s to the 2080s. And the bottom row shows precipitation changes. On the top row, the red color is the greatest warming. And you can see maybe Mongolia here, kind of under Lake Baikal. This is the average throughout the year. And this is the winter warming. So you can see that Mongolia, with this dark orange, is going to experience quite a lot of winter warming. In the summer, it's still going to experience some warming, but not to the same degree. So we're looking at maybe 3-4 degrees Celsius warming by 2080. And with the precipitation, I think this is even more dramatic. The green displays the increases in precipitation. And then when we look at the winter here, we see that there's going to be really significantly more winter precipitation. And this would be in the form of snow. And summer precipitation maybe a little bit greater, and that could be a good thing. It also depends on how it's spread out. You know, if it's just these torrents with flooding, that wouldn't be a good thing. But if they get a little more grass production from the summer precipitation, that could be beneficial. So you can probably imagine how these trends are likely to affect the incidence of zode. The increasing winter precipitation is likely to produce more frequent white zode with the thick layers of snow. And the increasing temperatures may produce more of the icy zode. If the temperature increases, if it's kind of wavering and causes that melting and refreezing, that could make things more difficult as well. So this is where I was in 2008. I spent 2 weeks at each of 5 sites. I did a survey of 30 herding households at each site, asking them about their experiences with zode, their strategies for dealing with zode, and then about other factors that might influence their vulnerability, like their wealth and education and experience and those types of things. I was lucky to be able to hire an assistant who was a very good friend of mine from my Peace Corps days. That was a lot of fun. So we went around together throughout the summer. And this is her husband, who was our driver, and this car felt like our home for 2 months, practically. We stayed with families in each place. This is our host family in Dondgo. I think it's interesting in this picture how much darker the man is, because he's the one who's out with the livestock all day long. So he's got quite a tan. And this is another family that I stayed with. This is a photo from Hoofskol, where this is up in the north in a more mountainous region. People focus on yaks a lot more. And this is some yaks and some cows and hybrids getting vaccinated. This is milking goats in the Gobi. Whoops, wrong button. And camels in the Gobi. Camels are great for Dzode because they hardly ever perish during these shocks. But unfortunately, camels are, the population is on a decline because people are finding a lot more economic value in cashmere goats. So goats like these. And goats are a lot more vulnerable to nature disasters.
Aren't goats also more destructive of the vegetation? They pull the roots out and make it.
Yeah. People who are worried about sustainable pasture management have discouraged the focus on goats. One of the activities I did with herders as part of the survey was, first of all, I talked to enough people so that I had an idea of what things they tended to worry about. And I wrote 5 of these things on cards. And with each participant, I asked them to put the one that was the biggest worry for them at the top, and then the second and the third. I combined all these results, and I found that Dzode is actually probably herders' biggest worry. And pasture degradation, water scarcity, poverty, and global warming are also worries. And a lot of people did point out that these are all interrelated. And they're worried about all of these things getting worse in the future. So because Dzode is such a big worry, even though it happens usually in the winter, sometimes in the spring, if it happens, people spend a lot of the year preparing for just the potential that it could occur. And I'm going to talk about some of the ways that they do that. So people, and it varies what they collect from region to region in Mongolia, but all families seem to want to stockpile feeds for their animals in case the pasture becomes unavailable during a Dzode. So hay, if you live in the desert, you would purchase hay often. Otherwise, you could go out and cut your own hay. And feed is purchased. It's could be oats, bran, that type of thing. People mix horse manure in with the hay. And the idea is that there's enough grass left in that it's still better than nothing. And here are some of the traditional things that people prepare, and this varies from place to place. Dzada is salted, dried wild plants. Barda is home brew that people make for their animals. They have some water and throw like vegetable peels or bran and things in it and let that ferment. You can keep that around for months. Sefs is what you get when Mongolians slaughter an animal. They make sausages out of the intestines, but the stuff that comes out of the intestines when you do this to clean them can be fed back to the animals, that semi-digested grass. Hoyu is what field bulls collect and line their burrows with, and some people will go around picking that out as another hay alternative. And then people actually feed their livestock different types of meat that they think are extra nourishing, like horse liver, horse fat, sometimes making a soup out of marmot meat. And they say that the livestock really enjoy these foods. And there are some newer nutritional supplements as well, like garlic, eggs, fish oil, and sometimes people use vitamin injections in the winter. Mongolians often devote a lot of energy to their winter shelter. This is constructed, it's often on the south side of the mountain, so it doesn't get the cold north wind. And no one grazes livestock near these shelters during the summer because you need to try to save that grass for the winter grazing. So in the summers, people would be out migrating a little bit more freely with their livestock, and then most people would have a winter shelter that they always come back to for the maybe 6 months or so of the winter. People warm or insulate this every year with things like dung or clothing or other materials. And a lot of people heap goat and sheep manure called boats on the ground. It needs to be well dried out first, but this can be kind of a insulated bedding for the livestock and can help keep them warm. And of course, it's hard to keep this dry. You put the livestock in the shelter overnight. And I've heard that during Zod, some people will actually get up in the night, take all of the animals out so that they would urinate somewhere else and then put them back in to try to keep the inside dry. Here's the inside of a shelter, a picture taken in March. You can see that a lot of the sheep have had their lambs at this time. And for the lambs in particular, a warm shelter is important. Herders also talk to me about how migration helps them manage the risk of Zod. Even the migrations that they do in the summer and the fall, they're trying to fatten up their animals as much as possible so that the animals will be hardier during the winter. A lot of visitors to Mongolia get the impression that during the winter, and I actually just said this, so herders don't move, they tend to stay put. But actually, I talk to a lot of people who have moved when times are hard during the winter. Even during a white Zod, sometimes people will shovel a path and move out with their yurt and their livestock to a place that has better grazing conditions. And of course, one of the challenges is then they wouldn't have their shelter. They can't take that with them. So I found that during Zod, some families are kind enough to take in these Zod refugees and share the shelter, which is pretty impressive because it always seems like one family's livestock just barely fit anyways. Another activity from my research was asking focus groups. So I got some groups of herders together, asked them what they need to be able to cope with Zod. Does it depend on poverty? Does it depend on, education or experience? And I had them make some cards and again put the cards in order, and combined results give us this ranking. It was pretty much unanimous that they thought that experience was the most important factor. They felt that new herders who had just gotten into it, didn't know what they were doing, were really vulnerable during Zod. Vehicle is important for migrations and for harvesting hay. If you have a large family, you have more people to help out with the winter tasks. I asked about whether it was helpful to have another job or source of income, and people said it could be helpful, but if it makes it hard to migrate or otherwise distracts you from herding, then it's not a good idea to have another job. People weren't sure whether education was helpful or not, probably not compared with experience. And a large herd can actually be a bad thing during Zod because you would have a harder time keeping all of those animals alive, unless you sell some, so then it could be helpful. Some people had told me that if you had a friend or relative in the government, in your local government, if aid came in from some development organization, you'd be more likely to get it. But but that was debated. And also, if you have a friend or relative in the city, some people said that they could get those folks to send money or even come out and help, but that wasn't the case for everyone I talked to. So just a couple quotes about experience here and what that entails. Someone told me, if herders don't have experience, they will lose a lot of animals. People should herd their animals by Mongolian methods. So when they talk about experience, they're talking about the traditional knowledge of herding. The government gives only a little hay to herders in an emergency. It's not even enough for one day. If there is a dzode, only the herders with good experience will get through it. But the government used to give a lot of assistance. There used to be quite a bit of support from both the communist state and the Nigdals. The Nigdals were herding collectives. The government would send some big trucks often that would allow herders to transport their animals to better places, and they would also distribute emergency feeds. And then with the transition, all of that support was withdrawn all of a sudden. In 1990, the new leaders of Mongolia decided that the transition to capitalism would be best done as a shock therapy transition, meaning that they'd make all the changes at once, and people would have a hard time, but that it would be for the best in the long run, and that people would recover. So this was hard for herders because even though they got to own more livestock personally, they lost their salaries and they lost that support during emergencies. So that raises the question of, could herders then cope with dzode on their own? And maybe some of you know that in 1999 and then again in 2000, herders were really put to the test, as there were very major dzodes during these years. And about a quarter of Mongolia's livestock died. A lot of families lost all of their livestock, and about 12,000 families had to move to the cities to look for other work. So it seemed to a lot of development organizations and other observers that herders were not coping on their own. And this brings me to the development section of my talk, but I'm going to jump to the US quickly because I make the argument that the ideas in development in Mongolia now have an ideological origin in the US. One author has called the period from the 1970s to the 1980s in the US the Great Risk Shift, when the government was maybe starting to tell people, you need to take responsibility for your own well-being. This contrasts in particular with the early part of the 20th century when we had more of a social democratic type of government. And along with this was what this author calls the crusade for personal responsibility. So families can and should be responsible for their own well-being. And it seems that these types of ideas were embedded in development that the US and other countries and international organizations carried out throughout the world. This type of development couldn't occur in Mongolia until the transition from communism to capitalism. And then I feel like this ideology took Mongolia by storm. So current development trends, the focus on individual responsibility. After those big dzode, 1999, 2000, 2001, a lot of organizations did give food aid and other kinds of aid to families that had suffered a lot. But at the same time, there were critics saying, you're maybe rewarding the laziest families. Or if you step in and help them every time, they're never going to learn how to help themselves. So this type of direct aid, even in emergencies, is now pretty much frowned upon by the development community. But they're doing other things like encouraging livelihood diversification, telling herders that in addition to herding, you could farm vegetables, you could sell souvenirs to tourists, or do this or that, and then if you lose your animals, you'll still have a backup. Improving weather forecasting and broadcasting so that people will be warned and then can deal better with risks. And the World Bank and some other organizations are trying to offer better insurance to herders. This is from ADRA's annual report 2005. ADRA is one of the development organizations working in Mongolia. I can't quite remember what it stands for, but it's an Adventist organization. And here they've taught herders to farm, and this is intended to help them survive Zod. I'll read the parts underlined in green. My father was a herder, and I too became a herder. But when we participated in ADRA's disaster preparedness project, not only was our livestock and livelihood secured, but our quality of life also improved. And down at the bottom, we do not know when the next Zod will occur, but what we know is that whenever the next Zod does happen, we will be better prepared thanks to our training. And ADRA has also been encouraging people to raise chickens, which is, it seems ironic because if we're worried about livestock dying in the winter, chickens aren't going to fare any better. And the problem with maybe the vegetable farming and the chickens is that they don't fit very well into the mobile lifestyle that herders think is important for fattening their animals for the winter. So to sum up what I think is going on in development in Mongolia now, herders are given skills and information to manage risk, and then they should be self-reliant even when Zod hits. This is an excerpt from a newspaper. This is but it's usually in Mongolian, and it's distributed to children in herding families. And this kind of instructing children in what they need to do to take responsibility as herders. Every young herder should remember that veterinary treatment and services are essential in order to minimize risk in the winter and forestall possible problems. And here's another excerpt from this same newspaper, urging people to vaccinate their livestock. In this cartoon, one of the steers here is sick with anthrax, I think it is. And the other one asks, did you get your vaccinations? And he says, no, my herder didn't do that. And this one exclaims in the yellow circle there, herders are so ignorant. And down at the bottom he says, you are going to teach your owner a big lesson if you die. So here we see that not only are the organizations kind of teaching personal responsibility and individual management of risk, but they're also attaching that to blame if people don't do what they're supposed to do. So what I see is happening is that a lot of information is supplied, and in the red squares there, people are being given education, advice, warnings, instructions. Then when the Zod comes along, if they're successful, that's great, but if they're unsuccessful, they're going to be blamed, and they're going to be blamed more because they were told all those things that they were supposed to do. So I think that this is one of the unfortunate consequences of some of the ideologies that are embedded in current development interventions. This is another picture from that spring storm in May. As you can see, these are goats huddled up together. They were huddling against the cold, and they all perished anyways. And when we visited this area, I just got there about a week after the disaster, but you get close to the hard-hit area, and there were just heaps of animals. The goats were in little groups, and the other ones were solo. But after this disaster, you listen to what people are saying about the herders, and the thing is, they knew this storm was coming. It was on the weather report days in advance, and there were instructions broadcast on the TV and the radio about what people were supposed to do to manage the risk, like keep your animals close to home on that day and put heavy things on the roof to keep your gear from being torn apart. But there were a lot of fatalities, even of people who were out during the storm trying to round their livestock up. And yurts were torn apart in the wind and things like that. So with the storm warnings and instructions, this really seems to have led to people saying that the herders who suffered the most were irrational. I heard people in the city saying, don't know what they could have been thinking, or that they were lazy. Someone working in development told me they prefer the risk to actually doing the work to make their animals safe. And I think that these accusations are problematic. For one thing, there may be limits to agency given the unpredictable nature of ZODE. Maybe, no matter what you do, how well you prepare, this type of disaster is unpredictable enough that some people are going to have bad luck. Maybe when herders apparently fail to do what they're supposed to do, that might sometimes be the fault of the program, a poorly designed program, something that wasn't culturally appropriate or that didn't make sense to people. And when herders are faulted for lacking common sense during disasters, I think we need to remember that what is considered common sense varies by culture. And I'm not the only one to have these criticisms, and I think that some of the cutting-edge development interventions are very promising. Things like herder participation in program planning. More organizations are asking herders, what do you need for us to support you better? Research of lingering constraints to coping. If herders aren't doing what you tell them to do to prepare for a potential disaster, is it because they can't afford to? Or are there other constraints that we aren't aware of? And then risk management by groups rather than individuals. Most organizations working in rural Mongolia now are actually encouraging herders to form, they don't call them collectives, like the collectives of the socialist era, but they call them herder groups, herder cooperatives, that kind of thing. And they encourage these people to help each other out in preparing and dealing with, preparing for and dealing with disasters. And that's it for my presentation. I want to thank the Center for East Asian Studies for bringing me here, and also the University of Arizona and the American Center for Mongolian Studies funded my research. I'd like to thank them as well. And I'd be happy for your comments or questions.
What are your plans to return to Mongolia?
Right now, I'm applying for funding to many organizations, and I hope to get funding for the entire year. If I don't get funding, my backup plan is to get a teaching job and try to interview herders on the side, but hopefully it won't come to that. And then because I'll be there through the winter, probably 9 to 12 months total, I think it would be harder to go around to several sites. So I'm going to choose one of these sites, probably in the Gobi Desert area, and get to know people really well and do more of this, but in depth. And I'd like to add a better, deeper historical perspective, interviewing people about things like, how did people talk about risk in the past? And you know, were there these same kinds of blaming phenomena that we're seeing now? And looking for, it's not necessarily just the development work that has caused the changes in, you know, people being blamed when they're the victims of disasters. There might be some other major causes for these changes as well. So I need to explore that further.
Did you notice many regional differences?
Yeah.
With the 5 sites you have,
Yeah.
pretty broad and spread out.
Definitely. So, I mean, there were differences on so many levels, like what livestock species they specialize in. Camels and goats in the south, and cattle in the middle, and yaks up in the north a little bit more. What kinds of feed they prepare to give to their livestock when there's no grass. It depends on what's available. Marmots are just, you can hunt marmots in certain parts of the country, but not others. The brewing the beer to give to the animals, I only heard about that in Bayanhongr, which is in the Gobi Desert. I don't know why, but it seems like there might be some local traditional knowledge that isn't spread throughout the country.
Did you produce a monograph on these questions? Because I don't think that it's been very much researched.
I'm glad that you don't think so, because that helps my funding chances. Yeah, I'll produce a dissertation, and if I get to eventually publish a version of that, that would be terrific. Yeah.
I've noticed that a lot of biographical works on Mongolia that deal with herders, their main concern is horse breeders,
yeah.
racehorse breeders in particular.
I saw that in the library, in the livestock section. There's a big section on how to train good racehorses. Yeah. And yeah, I guess I'm looking at the livestock in a more utilitarian sense and as the basis of their livelihood. It's not that horses don't, and even racehorses, they still fit into that, but that's not something I'm going to be able to focus on, especially if I'm in the Gobi, where you don't see a lot of horses now. You don't even see, motorcycles have been replacing the camels, so you don't even see a lot of camels left.
Is the gasoline a problem? Expensive?
You'd think that, and when I was there in 2008, people were complaining that it was really, really expensive. And I guess, I mean, motorcycles are better than cars, so that's one thing. Camels are expensive as well. So I'm planning to take a motorcycle course before I leave, just in case it's a necessary skill to have.
Are you going to get a 2-humped motorcycle or a 1?
Right. Right.
You speak Mongolian.
Yeah. Yep. I speak it. When I do interviews, I always, people generally talk slowly to me anyways, and then I often say, now did I understand you correctly? Did you say this and this? And I paraphrase and make sure that I get everything. It can be a challenge, but I expect I'll improve more when I'm there again.
Is there one predominant aid organization that you are aware of, or there are just so many of them in their different places? Is there cooperation among them?
There are some main ones. The World Bank is active there and partners with other organizations.
Soros Foundation.
Yeah, great. World Vision, and they're one that actually still does a lot of just giving food to people, which is becoming unusual. Mercy Corps is very active in the Gobi, and they're more business oriented. Let's teach people to be good business people and connect them to markets. And instead of giving aid to maybe the people who need it the most, they give it to the people who seem to be most enterprising, is my perception from talking with them. ADRA, which I mentioned, the Adventist one, and Save the Children. So I was going to mention also that the ACMS, the American Center for Mongolian Studies, has both short-term and long-term research grants. And some of them even, I believe, go to people who don't speak Mongolian, and they can go over and take classes in conjunction with their research or prior to their research.
Doug Nord and I went to Mongolia this last March.
Yeah, I heard that.
ACMS was instrumental in helping us get around and whatnot, which the traffic
Yeah.
is horrible.
I know. It's scary,
It's
yeah.
easier to walk through a herd of stampeding cattle than to go across the street. No matter what the light's saying, it's always cars. Yeah.
It's really dangerous,
The
yeah.
best thing to do is to find a very old woman, and she's
Yeah.
still on the cross, you go with her.
Mhm.
Yeah.
People, foreigners who stay there long enough, I think they get complacent, like the Peace Corps volunteers. And they think, well, now I've crossed the road a bunch of times and nothing's ever happened, but can you ever use that as a basis of, yeah.
So are there any more questions or discussion? This is a wonderful presentation. The visuals were so striking
Oh.
from many parts of Mongolia.
Mhm.
And I'm sure that you're collecting a body of photographs that eventually can go into your publication.
What I need now are the photographs of the sips and the all the things that they make, yeah.
Right.
So I'll work on that, yeah. Mhm.
Very good. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.